Happy Easter, and thank you for listening to this message from Northwest Hills Community Church in Corvallis, Oregon. You can learn more about our church at nwhills.com. Today, lead pastor Josh Carstensen is continuing a series on women of the Bible while celebrating Easter. When Mary Magdalene visits the tomb, she's completely devastated because the person who redeemed her and transformed her life is dead. And what's worse, she thinks someone stole Jesus' body, so she can't even grieve properly. It's in this moment that Jesus meets Mary and speaks his first words since rising from the dead. And instead of making a bold statement, he asks a question. It's a beautiful moment that each of us can experience. Also, as part of the Something to Say series, we'll start the message with a compilation of all the previous testimonies. It's really good. We hope you find it encouraging. Now, here's today's message.
Hi, my name is Stephen Campbell.
My name's Austin Ray.
Martha Wagner.
Josh Armatano.
Heather Keir.
Barb Pearson.
Bonnie Ray.
Ellis Wilson.
Quentin.
Ben.
Sean.
Annabelle.
My name is Andy Ross, and following Jesus has changed my life.
Following Jesus has changed my life.
Following Jesus has changed my life.
Changed my life.
Changed my life. Changed my life in that I have hope for a future that I wouldn't have in a very hopeless world.
My story is one of brokenness, followed by years of me trying to fix it on my own.
So my story starts with actually getting injured at the gym.
My story starts when I was in 8th grade.
It's a testimony of God's miracles.
It all kind of began back when I was in New Zealand. It's where I met my now wife. We were both atheists. I would say I was a devout atheist, which is kind of funny to see where I am now.
God sent people to help me grow as a believer.
A girl that just befriended me and invited me home for Easter.
Pastor Gary invites me with the youth group to go down to Hume Lake, California.
I was arrested for drug dealing.
I started to struggle with depression.
I don't understand. I'm trying to serve you. I'm trying to pursue you. I'm trying to stop these thoughts, but I can't.
I was so afraid.
Broken.
Searching.
Pouring out emotion.
At the same time, I was praying and asking God,
Are you going to reach out to me today? Like, are you going to talk to me and tell me where you want me? Are you going to show me the door, come down and say, like, this is where I want you?
He came and met me in my brokenness.
I heard Jesus say, "My child, I'm with you."
I knew it was him.
It's always been him.
Once I started reading the Bible, it all started making sense.
To find out that there was a God, and to think about what that meant really changed how I viewed the world, and the lens that I looked at everything changed.
The world actually got brighter.
I started to see Jesus moving in my own life.
I prayed for the first time. I read for the first time. You don't have to know everything straight away. There's a lot you don't know. I feel like the more you know you don't know. Don't feel overwhelmed.
Fear doesn't have to rule you.
trust him and watch what God can do in your life.
I never could have imagined my life being like this. You know, it's such a stark contrast from where I was to where I am now.
God is just a God of second chances.
I just stand back in astonishment.
There are no guarantees, but I will tell you that God was faithful in my case.
He's faithful, merciful, kind,
incredible,
patient,
constant,
amazing,
so grand.
God wants to free you.
He wants to hear you. He wants to heal you.
You are never too far gone for God. He will not harm you. He will prosper you. He will give you a hope and a future.
You can never outrun God's love for you.
Good morning. My name is Josh Carstensen, lead pastor here. A couple miracles going on. Number one, Jesus rose from the dead, right? That's significant, right? Number two, JJ, our music guy, I brought a little baby in here somewhere. So, little baby. Good job, Windsor. Good job. Number three, Pavel, first Easter, became a believer, first Easter. I love that. So, praise God. Yeah. Number four, I can't believe the Lady Beavers won. That's crazy. Just joking. I have no idea. I don't know anything about that. I might be getting tired. I did tell someone Merry Christmas on the way in. So Hey, that's all right. Her name is Mary, so I feel like that tripped me up, but it's good. It's good. Happy Easter. Man, Easter is one of those Sundays where when you're preparing for it, you're always thinking like, how do I just like bring the best possible message? Because it's a big deal, right? I mean, the Sunday is clearly the apex of the Christian faith. If Jesus doesn't raise, like, our faith is void. And so you really want to do a good job at Easter. And as a pastor, I'm like always just like, I want people to get it. And I know not everyone who's here today is like a regular, yes, Jesus church attender. And so I really want you to see the heart of God for you. And to do that, there's always different ways to communicate it. There's different aspects and kind of different ways that we can talk about, like, why does Easter matter? Why is this important? How is the Jesus raising? How is it even possible? And so, you can think about like giving different proofs, if you will, or different logical arguments of why this is actually really reasonable to believe in. In fact, how it's like the most reasonable explanation of a guy named Jesus living a few thousand years ago, how it's reasonable to believe that he's God, even though it kind of blows our minds. And so that's one angle that we can look at. I think sometimes it's good to talk about the historicity of Jesus and how and why he came to earth and what that would have looked like and all the dynamics that were at play in kind of the nation and what was going on politically and what was going on historically and all those things. There's just a lot there. There's a lot of anticipation and there's a lot of hope and there's a lot of longing. There's a lot of anger and frustration and Jesus is killed through it all. And so there's just so much there. You think about sometimes wanting to communicate like what Jesus himself was actually going through, right? And so you take a minute and you just really think through all the dynamics of what were happening both on Friday and Sunday morning when he raises. A few months ago, I read you a quote about the life of Jesus. And the quote said this. It said, "You cannot write a more tragic story." Right? You think about Jesus dying. You cannot write a more tragic story. It's impossible. Because it is the story of the aggregation of everything that people are afraid of. Think about all the things that would cause us to live in fear. That is the story of Jesus' life. There was no death more painful than crucifixion. Right? That's why the Romans invented it, to punish political miscreants, the slow, agonizing death by suffocation and dehydration and exposure, extraordinarily painful. Plus, what's coming, and that's a part of the story. Right? You think like Jesus came and he knew that his life was going to culminate in this moment. And that doesn't exactly cause for a great night's sleep, right? When you know something like this is coming. Plus, your best friend betrayed you, right? Plus, your own people turned against you. Plus, they're led by a tyrant who doubts truth. Plus, you're a victim of the Roman Empire. Plus, you're completely innocent and everybody knows it. And they choose a criminal to be released from this experience instead of you, even though they know he's a criminal and they know that you're innocent and you're young and all you've done is help people. Right? You think about all these things and there's so much that could be said. There's so much that I want to communicate. On top of all the things about Easter that I want to communicate, there's this heart desire that we always have of like, man, I want every person who comes in here and who watches online, when they leave, like my hope is even if you don't believe it's true, I want you to believe that it's true. Like I want you to hear this story and go, that is such an incredible story. It's so good that I want it to be true, even if I'm struggling to in fact believe it's true. Like so that's a huge hope here. That we would want this story to be true, even if we struggle to believe it. So there's a lot to share. All right, so I always wrestle with, what am I going to share? And now that I've taken up 5 of 35 minutes, I have even less time to share what I want to share. But what are we going to do? Right? Some of you, you've been following along in the journals that we made. And we initially were planning on looking at kind of the life of Mary, the mother of Jesus. And we're making a little bit of a turn here, and we're not looking at that. We're looking at a different Mary this morning, but more than just Mary, we're looking at Jesus' first words after he raises from the dead. If there was ever a moment to lean in and to say, what was Jesus saying? What was his something to say? When you conquer death, it seems like that would be the time where we say, I wonder what he has to say. I wonder if there's something that I can learn about the nature and character of Jesus just hearing his words, not even telling the whole story, but literally just hearing his words. Again, if there is ever a time to listen to the words of Jesus, it's here and it's now, right when he raises. And he happens to speak these words to a woman. Her name's Mary Magdalene. She's got a powerful story of total life change. We're going to hear a little bit of her story here in a bit. But as her life was radically changed, she gave her life to following Jesus. Her and a number of other different women, they actually funded and supported the life of Jesus and some of his followers, traveling with him. And Mary is mentioned a lot, more than any other woman in the New Testament other than the mother of Jesus. So she is an integral part of Jesus' life. And we meet her in the midst of the darkest, deepest moment in her life, when she goes to what she experiences as the empty tomb. And we're going to hear the words of Jesus as he meets her in this place. And so if you are able, would you stand? We're going to go to John chapter 20 and unfold the story as Jesus meets Mary for the first time. I'm just going to read the first 2 verses of John 20. When I'm done, I'm going to say, "This is the word of the Lord," and you can say, "Thanks be to God." Here we go. This is John 20. The words should be up there. It says, "Now on the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene came to the tomb early while it was still dark and saw that the stone had been taken away from the tomb. So she ran and went to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one whom Jesus loved, and said to them, 'They have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we do not know where they have laid him.'" This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. You can take a seat. Man, my hope is that after hearing these words of Jesus, we will walk out of here just with a little clearer picture of who Jesus is. And that understanding a little bit more of who Jesus is, we will solidify in ourselves a little bit stronger of faith that will give us something to share. And so immediately we meet this Mary. This is an interesting introduction to this story, especially if you've read some of the other gospel accounts of this. To be honest, it can be a little bit confusing if you read the other gospel accounts. If you read it carefully, you might think, man, this actually seems contradictory, because here's John, and John's writing, and he says, Mary visits the empty tomb. But if you read another gospel writer, he'll say, well, there were 3 women who visited the tomb. And then another writer will say there were 2 women who visited the tomb. And there's another writer who says, well, there's just a bunch of women who visited the tomb. And so you might look at that and you might go like, man, if this is like the most important moment in the history of the Christian faith, like, is this even a reliable source? And I'll say 2 things to that. Number one, when Mary goes and she goes back to the other disciples, she has this very particular phrase that she says to them. She says, "They have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we do not know where they have laid him." So even though John zooms in on one person, she makes it clear here that there's more than one person with her at the tomb. And I think this is important, and here's why I'm making this point. Here's why I'm even bringing this up. I'm bringing this up for 2 reasons. Number one, the Gospels, there's 4 different books that talk about the life and death and resurrection of Jesus, and they all talk about it from a different angle because they're from different perspectives, from different people. And so the stories aren't always describing the same events in the exact same way. It doesn't mean that it contradicts one another. It just means that it's telling it from a different angle. But the other reason that I want to bring this up in particular is that John zooms in on one person. There were other people there. It's even clear in his context. But it's important that for us to know, like, man, there's a lot that's going on, and God sees us as one person in the midst of a lot of different people. See, it can be easy on Easter, right? It can be easy in a full room. It can be easy to think about the Easter Sunday and all the things that are happening around the world and forget about the fact that God says, Kent, I see you and I care about you. Right? It can be easy to forget that, right? Laura, I see you. And I love that the gospel writer, John, he zooms in on one interaction with one person. And so for thousands of years, we've been seeing Jesus' heart for one person, even though there are many in this story. I think it's important to know that God sees us as individuals. So Mary's at the empty tomb. It's empty. She goes back. She gets Peter and John, some of her friends. They go back. It's still empty. The boys, they leave. They're scared. There's a lot of fear of them getting arrested because they just killed Jesus and they don't want to be associated. So they leave. And Mary's at this tomb in total devastation. Right? This is the moment of like heartache beyond heartache. It doesn't get worse than this. Here's a very close friend who changed my life, who gave me a radical new trajectory. Now he's gone. Not only is he gone, but I can't even mourn his death at his grave. Like, that's dehumanizing. Like, imagine a close friend or a family member was killed tragically, and you have the memorial, and a couple days later you go to the grave and someone ripped it out. Like, you're just wondering in that moment, what in the world is going on? Like, I can't even mourn the loss of a friend. And it's in this season, it's in this moment that Jesus meets her. Now, for us, some of us, we can sympathize with that. We can put ourselves in this place of total devastation. Maybe it's more recently in life. Maybe it's a season in the past. I don't know, maybe life's really good and it's hard to sympathize with it. But you can imagine being in your lowest of lows. And that's right where Mary is. And it's in that moment that Jesus meets her. And he gives us 3 different statements. The first thing that we read is from John chapter 20, verse 11. We read this, "But Mary stood weeping outside the tomb. And as she wept, she stooped to look into the tomb. But she saw 2 angels in white sitting where the body of Jesus had lain, one on the head and one at the feet. They said to her, 'Woman, why are you weeping?' She said to them, 'They have taken away my Lord, and I do not know where they have laid him.' Having said this, she turned around and saw Jesus standing, but she did not know that it was Jesus. Jesus said to her, 'Woman, why are you weeping? Whom are you seeking?'" Why are you weeping? Whom are you seeking? Now, it seems kind of strange to me that if the King of the universe rose from the dead, the very first, "Hey, I'm back," go tell word to Caesar, to Herod, big mistake. I think there's a lot of things that could easily have been said in that moment. But Jesus does what he often does. He asks a question. And his question, we see this many times in the life of Jesus. They seem obvious. He knows the answer to these questions, right? There's a couple different places. One is early on in his life, and there's a couple followers of John the Baptist, and they see Jesus, and they're like, "Ooh, that's who we really want to follow." So they start literally kind of walking behind him. They want to meet him, and Jesus turns to them, and he says, "Hey, what do you want me to do for you?" He knows the answer to that. A couple different moments. There was one time there was 2 blind men. They were friends, and Jesus comes up to them, and he asks them, "What would you like me to do for you?" Right? There's another moment of another blind man. There's another moment of a guy who's been lame for 38 years, and Jesus goes up to him and says, "Do you want me to make you well?" That's a very obvious question, right? And then the greatest, most obvious question, God shows up and he asks a silly question, "Where are you?" It's not because God doesn't know the answer to that question. Jesus, when he asks Mary, "Why are you weeping?" it's not because he doesn't know, it's because he cares. Right? He meets Mary in her deepest moment and says, "Hey, I see that you are really hurting. I see that you got a lot going on, and I want to know. I want to hear from you. Tell me your heart." Right? The God of the universe, he doesn't just come out and make all these statements. He says, "Hey, I see you. I want to know what's going on." And the invitation to us is the same. Obviously, it looks a little different. This afternoon, I'm not going to have Jesus sitting next to me saying, "So Josh, tell me about today. Was it tiring? How'd you do in the 3rd service?" Right? That's not how this relationship works, but the invitation, share about how you're doing. And for some of us, it may be like, "Hey, tell me about this amazing season of life that you are in." Right? You found a new love of your life. You're super excited. Tell me about it. I want to hear. Right? For some of you, he may be like, "Man, tell me how you're doing in this really hard season." Right? Or this in-between, or "Tell me about your vacation. How was Cabo?" Or whatever it is. Tell me about life. I want to hear. And so we have an opportunity to respond just through prayer and say, "God, here's what's going on." I did that this last week. My family was gone. I was sitting on my couch by myself. And normally I pray. I'm always, 99% of the time, I'm just quiet. I just in my mind. But I started praying out loud, and I just started talking to God, "God, hey, here's what's going on. Here's some of my feels. Here's some of the things that I've been going through." Not only has God invited us to do that through prayer, but he gives us other people, right? He intentionally gives us people to say, "Hey, Joe, how are you doing? And I want to hear from you. Like, I want to genuinely have a conversation, and this is why we put a lot of effort into relationships around here. We think they're important. Like, God gives us each other. It's not just that we have just a me and God relationship, but he gives us other people to have these conversations with. But the point is, he wants us to communicate with him, right? And he doesn't want us to have this attitude of, like, well, he already knows. I don't need to tell him. No, the invitation is there. He makes it very clear to Mary, how are you doing? Why are you crying? He continues on, and he says, what are you seeking? Right? What are you seeking? Now, if that's not an Easter question, I don't know what is. Right? What are you for? She's looking for a corpse. She's looking for a dead Jesus. Right? Like, that's what she's assuming Jesus is in this moment. She's assuming dead people don't rise. I want to mourn. I want to grieve. I want to weep. I want to cry. I want to meet a dead Jesus. Now, we walk in here this morning, and we all have different hopes of what kind of Jesus we're going to meet. Right? And depending upon where you are in life, depending upon the things that you're going through, we have different desires and different hopes, right? Some of us want a clarifying Jesus. Jesus, I would love some clarity in my life. Can you just give me some clarity? Right? Most of us have some sort of semblance of a desire for Jesus that would just kind of make my life a little bit better. Jesus, I would love a Jesus who just makes my life a little bit better. Right? Some of us would love an ATM Jesus, like a little bit short on rent this month. Maybe dip in the offering plate, whatever it takes, Lord. I'm just saying. You know, we have these different desires. Some of us want a liberator Jesus, an affirming Jesus. Jesus, would you just affirm everything that I think about myself and the world? Would you just say, yes, it's all good? Right? God, Jesus, would you do this? We come in here with all these different desires, all these different hopes. Jesus makes it clear, and he asks her, what are you seeking? Again, he asks this because he cares. And before we move on, I just want to point out, like, how beautiful is it that the King of the universe, the first thing that he says is, hey, I care about you as a person. Like, that's what he's doing. I care about you as a person. Like, if that's not a God that that don't want to follow, I don't know what kind of God you would want to follow. Like a God who the first thing he says is, man, I deeply care about you. Like, you matter to me. We're going to see Mary responds to this question. At this point, she still doesn't know that it's Jesus. Now, I don't know the intricacies of if she just didn't recognize him or she was so, like, distraught that she couldn't. I don't know, but she doesn't know that it's him yet for whatever reason. In verses 15 and 16, we read this. Supposing him to be the gardener, she said to him, Sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you have laid him, and I will take him away. Again, she's devastated. She's looking for a dead Jesus, and we see the second statement that Jesus makes. Jesus said to her, Mary. He says her name. She turned and said to him in Aramaic, Rabboni. Are happening. The first thing that we have is a flooding of memory. Right? You have to believe that she hears Jesus say her name, and the person who radically changed her life just comes in full clarity of, I cannot believe that my life is restored in this very moment. And just the emotion that had to have been there, it was profound. Because if you know Mary's story, her story is one of radical change. We don't know a lot of the particulars, but we know some very specifics. We do know one thing. We know that the Bible says that she was possessed by 7 demons. Now, that's tricky to understand. What did that look like? You know, what was that all about? And we know one other person who that happened to, and the idea was that they were totally not in control of themselves. Right? And this guy's name was Legion, and Legion was kicked out of his community. He was living in isolation in caves. He was constantly throwing himself on the ground. He was cutting himself. He was mentally, physically, socially, relationally cut off from everyone. And Jesus comes to him in that deep pain, and he frees him. And the same is true with Mary. Right? We have to believe she was fully not in control of her life, and Jesus frees this woman, and she gives her life to following him. You think through some of the dynamics of what that would have been like for her with her family, with her mom and dad. I don't know if she had a husband. It doesn't say anything about that. But what would it have been like to go from just absolute isolation to restoration? Like, that is a massive transformation. We know that quickly on, she and her other friends are funding the life of Jesus, which is interesting because you think, like, how is she able to get those kinds of funds that quickly? And this is total speculation, but I think she probably came from money, and that relationship was probably severed when she was in her dark place, and I think Jesus restores all of that. I think he restores her completely, and now she's following Jesus. And when Jesus calls her by name and he says, Mary, all these feelings come back. All of them. Not only do they all come back, but I think the other thing that we're seeing when Jesus calls her by name is he's saying, hey, you came here looking for a certain Jesus. Let me turn your expectations upside down of who I really am. Because I'm not just a dead Jesus. I am fully alive. And for us who come in here with different expectations of who we want Jesus to be, I think the message for us is Jesus is so much more than we think that we want, right? We have these little ideas of Jesus can be this for me. He's like, well, yeah, I can be this, but I can be a whole lot more than just this for you. I got so much more, and this is what he's doing to Mary as he calls her by name. And then we see the last words he says to her in verse 17. It says, as Jesus said to her, do not cling to me, for I have not yet ascended to the Father. But go to my brothers and say to them, I'm ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God. Now, once again, this is kind of a tricky, like what's going on here? And the other gospel writers, they'll talk about there's multiple women like clinging to the feet of Jesus. And I don't think this is this moment where Jesus is like, get off me. I need some space. I just rose from the dead. I'm tired. Like, come on. Clearly, that's not what's happening here. What's happening here is Jesus is saying, like, hey, it's going to be okay. Like, it's okay to be sad, but I conquered fear. I conquered death. I'm ascending. I think it's really important that we recognize the reality that he doesn't just focus on the fact that he conquered death, but his job's not done. He's doing something bigger than just conquering death, that he's going to reign in heaven, kind of symbolizing the idea that everything's going to be okay, Mary. Like, no matter what's going on, no matter if you are in Ukraine right now and you woke up and you didn't have power and you don't know what's going to happen to your life this next week, or whether you're in Corvallis and everything's just great and you're so excited for Tuesday where it's going to be sunny, like big picture, Jesus reigning on the throne is this picture that, you know what? It's going to be okay. I've conquered sin and death and it's all going to be all right. I got this. And then he does something beautiful. He commissions her. He says, I want you to go do something. I want you to go get and tell your friends, tell my disciples to come back. Which I think, first of all, is interesting. Like, why wouldn't Jesus just do that himself? Right? It seems like he would be a better person to do that job. Right? If I'm Mary and Jesus is like, hey, go tell them that I've risen from the dead, I feel like I'd turn that right back on Jesus and be like, hey, I feel like you could do a better job at that than me. And to be truthful, I feel like that's just as true today as it was back then. I feel like when Jesus is like, hey, go tell the world that I conquered sin and death, I feel like it's really easy to just be like, I feel like you do a better job at that than me. But apparently, in your infinite wisdom, you've got a plan that's better than mine. And so I'm going to do my best to do that. And then you think about the message that Jesus gives to his disciples. And this message is important. You think about the last time that Jesus was with his disciples. They're in the garden. It's before he's killed. It's before he's arrested. They all flee. All of his closest friends leave. John, one of his close friends, was there with him at the crucifixion, but everyone else is gone. And what Jesus doesn't do when he's speaking to Mary is he doesn't say, hey, can you go tell all our friends, like, hey, what happened on Friday night? Because I got busted and you guys all ran away. And I went through my darkest hour and no one was here. What does he do? He says, hey, come back. Come back. And I think this is a really important message for us to hear. I think there's a lot of people who come to church on Easter and who will watch this week who, for whatever reason, I'll just say, man, you once had some sort of faith and you once had an experience with the Lord, and for whatever reason, whether you are disconnected, where you are not plugged in, whether you are really not following the Lord like you should, I think that can come with guilt and shame. And I think Jesus just wants you to say, hey, like, come back. Like, there's no shame. There's no guilt. Come back. And on this last week, I was on a plane my family and I went down to California, and I had to come back early to get ready for Easter. And I was by myself, and I sat next to this guy, and we start talking. Super fun guy. He's like a guy you'd want to kick it with down in Mexico for a week type of guy. And so we're talking, we're having a good time, and he's telling me about the weekend that he had in Vegas with some of his friends. And it was a very colorful story. I was just enjoying all the details. He's telling me all this story, and then the inevitable question comes out, right? He's like, well, what do you do for work? And you kind of just got to slip it in there. I'm a pastor. And he literally did a double take. He's like, well, wait, what did you say? Yes, I am a pastor. I work at a church. I love Jesus. And then you just see the wheels spinning, and you see the conversation is like, oh man, I used to go to church back in the day. And man, my mom actually works at a church. And you can just see, and like my hope for someone like that is like, there's no shame in struggling and figuring out life. Jesus is not angry as much as he is saying, like, welcome back. Like, I want you to come back. Like, yes, there are things that we all need to sort out. But the first thing that Jesus is saying to his disciples is like, come back. Like, it's okay. Like, my grace is sufficient for your weakness. I love you right where you are. Come back. And I love that about what Jesus says to his disciples. And as we end and we wrap it up, Mary takes this message, and what does she say? She's got this very particular phrase. She goes to the disciples and she says, I have seen the risen Lord. She's like, I have had an encounter. I've had an experience. And man, she got to see it in a way that honestly I'm a little bit jealous of. Like, I feel like that would be so incredible. Like, if I got to see that, but man, we get to experience that in a different way. Right? But then when we experience it, we have a commissioning like her, that we have something to say, that we have a story, and it hits us all differently. But the point is, when we get to know the real Jesus, when we see him, we do have something to say, and that's the commission that Jesus gives us to send to the world. Man, as we wrap it up here, I'm going to pray, and I just want us to recognize that, man, Jesus had something to say for the very first time after he rose from the dead. And he meets us right where we are. He calls us. He commissions us. He invites us. Father God, I think about this moment here with Mary. And it's so particular. You didn't have to record this one conversation, but you did. And it's the first words that you said. And in your first words, God, you show more than anything, you have a deep care for us as humans. God, for any friend in here this morning who came in and who didn't believe that you cared about them, I pray that this would just be an encouragement. That you can call us by name. God, that you don't just see us as a collective, you don't just see us as a whole, but you see us as individuals first. God, that as you're calling us by name, you are a God who can radically change. And we have a part to play in that, right? Mary had a decision. Do I want to follow Jesus? God, I pray that we would make that choice to follow you. God, the King who paid for my sin that I couldn't pay for, who gives me a hope and a future. God, I pray that we would be a people who recognize that you commission us to. That once we've been saved, God, that we have a job to do. Go tell the disciples. And the story that you have to tell them is, I've conquered death, and I want you back. I love you right where you are. And I pray that we would be a church that heralds that loud. And that we'd be a church with open arms for anyone who walks in to say, Jesus' death is sufficient for you. Man, that we would be a church that celebrates dead people walking, that celebrates life. And Lord, that ultimately we would see that you came not just to raise, but to ascend. God, that ascension really matters. Because again, it says that you're about a bigger picture and a bigger story than just your life on earth, but your life in heaven is a bigger story. That you are currently sitting at the right hand of the Father, and you are interceding for everyone in this room. God, and that story says that no matter what's happening, it's going to be all right if I've got faith in you. I pray that we would hold on to that today. I pray that we would believe that, and I pray that with that, we would leave here with something to say. We love you, Jesus. Amen. Love you guys.
Thanks for listening to today's teaching from Northwest Hills Community Church. We hope you find ways to apply the gospel to your life. And be sure to check out our website, nwhills.com, where you'll find ways to engage with us. And if you're able, we'd love to see you at church next Sunday. Thanks again for listening.